The beast was horrifying. Even from a distance, it was clear that the massive creature rivaled a well-fed calf in size. And yet, not a single calf had gone missing during the 3 years of its bloody reign of terror across the county. The victims had been, for the most part, children. Occasionally, women working on farms or shepherds tending flocks of sheep and cattle, but most often it was children. The beast had a twisted craving for young, tender flesh. It tore and mangled it with sadistic delight, then left the ravaged remains in plain sight, ensuring they would be found easily. The beast thrived on the stench of despair and terror that hung in the air ever since it became evident that local hunters were powerless against the evil stalking them. The creature was too fast and cunning for ordinary wolf traps. Organized hunts had long yielded no results. The body count only grew. Will Harper silently watched the motley procession as it made its way through town. 2 town criers, a deputy sheriff, and a cavalry unit surrounded a wagon with a glass display case. Inside the case was the beast. Its thick, dark fur, streaked with sparse patches of lighter coloring, bristled along its withers. Its posture betrayed readiness for a powerful leap. Saliva seemed to drip from its enormous fangs, and its eyes gleamed with frozen bloodlust and an insatiable, endless hunger. The beast was dead. Killed several days ago during an unexpectedly successful hunt, it had been gutted, taxidermied, and placed in the display case as proof that the horror was finally over. But was it truly over? As the procession drew nearer, Will slipped through the crowd, ducking into a nearby alley. He circled around, taking a detour through deserted streets to end up behind the parade, avoiding the monstrous silhouette being paraded down the main thoroughfare. Will had encountered the beast before. Alive. That was 2 years ago when it had attacked him and 3 of his friends in the woods, a day that still haunted him in nightmares over and over again. If it hadn't been for Jack, all 4 of them, 4 foolish boys, would have ended up in the beast's insatiable maw, just like over 50 of their neighbors that year. And who could have guessed that Jack, that scrawny, freckled boy with a long neck and a button nose, would prove brave enough not to freeze at the sight of the creature? The beast had crept up on them near the Salmon River bend. Its shoulders were chest-high to Will, its dark fur mottled with uneven patches that stood out starkly against the local wildlife. Its elongated snout and protruding fangs, paired with eyes that gleamed with an unearthly malice, left no doubt. It was the same beast that Mary Jane had narrowly escaped not long before. Jack had stared at the beast with horror at first, but then a different fire lit in his green eyes. An unyielding fury, the fury of someone who would not surrender their life that day. Jack picked up a rock and hurled it at the beast as it closed to within 10 paces. The stone struck it square in the forehead, causing the beast to shake its head and falter, its leap unmade. Luke and Clem instantly caught on. They grabbed sticks and small river stones from the ground, and the beast was assailed with shouts and whoops by anything the boys could lay their hands on. Jack's voice rose above the others, unleashing every curse he knew at the creature. Meanwhile, Will clung fearfully to a tree trunk behind his friends, unable to move or even lift a hand. To everyone's astonishment, the beast seemed confused by the sudden counterattack. It snarled and growled, pacing on the spot for what felt like an eternity before turning tail and trotting evenly into the forest. Jack, Will, Luke, and Clem became the only children to face the creature and live to tell the tale. The sheriff recognized their bravery. The boys were rewarded with a small fortune, $100 split between them, and they couldn't believe their luck. But Will found no joy in their newfound wealth. He had done nothing by the river bend and felt he deserved nothing. If it hadn't been for his parents, he would have refused the hated money outright, as it seemed to mock his cowardice. The procession moved further away, the crowd following with victorious cheers. But Will felt no elation. He kept expecting the lifeless taxidermy to blink its yellow eye, or for the familiar guttural growl to sound from behind the glass. Mary Jane didn't join the others outside to face her fear like her neighbors had. When the cheers and whoops reached her home accompanying the parade, she pulled a flask from her pocket, uncapped it, and took a long drink. The flask had been her constant companion for the past 2 years, often bringing her a measure of comfort simply by existing. Now, Mary Jane needed every ounce of strength she could muster to endure these few days, while the beast, though dead, roamed her town's streets. She should have gone out and confirmed for herself that it was truly him. Perhaps then she might have found some long-awaited peace. But the last time Mary Jane had dared to look at a stuffed specimen, she hadn't slept for 3 nights, plagued by sticky nightmares. By day, she couldn't cope with the panic attacks without her flask. All because that taxidermy, a giant wolf with an unnaturally large head, belonged to a creature that was terrifying in its own right. But it hadn't been him. Mary Jane let out a quiet sob as memories came rushing back, but she quickly pulled herself together. She hadn't faltered before the beast on that day, and she wouldn't falter now. Her mind conjured the image of Annie's gentle face, her little sister. Blonde curls that twisted softly at the ends, a sprinkling of freckles across pale skin, and gray-blue eyes full of innocent admiration when they looked at Mary Jane. Annie was only 14. She loved to embroider while humming old ballads she'd learned from their grandmother. Just 2 houses down lived Clint, a cheerful and slightly clumsy boy, and he and Annie had been head over heels for each other. Sometimes, lying sleepless in bed, Mary Jane imagined what life could have been like if evil hadn't descended on their land. Annie and Clint would have surely married, had a few little ones with their mother's eyes and their father's smile, and her sister would still be singing in her bright, lilting voice while kneading dough for a pie or tying up the apple tree in their yard. Mary Jane could have spent her whole life listening to her. That day, the 2 of them had argued a bit about Clint. Mary Jane thought him an unpolished fool, albeit a charming one. She couldn't resist teasing him, much to Annie's repeated annoyance. They'd been bickering all the way to the suspension bridge over the Lemmy River. Annie's cheeks flushed pink from the brisk walk and her frustration, her braid coming undone in the wind. If Mary Jane had known that was the last time they'd speak, she'd have abandoned her teasing and instead hugged Annie tight, telling her how much she loved her. The river came into view, along with the frail little bridge swaying in the wind. All they had to do was cross to the other side, and the Ewing Ranch was just a short walk away. But then Annie's face went pale as a sheet. Her eyes, wide with terror, stared at something behind Mary Jane. She pointed, trembling. Mary Jane turned, and her heart sank into her stomach. The beast was approaching, creeping low to the ground. But the moment it realized it had been spotted, it rose, baring yellowed teeth, and lunged at the girls. Mary Jane stumbled backward, tripping over something and falling just as the beast readied itself to leap. She would have surely died in the next instant if Annie hadn't grabbed a rock from the ground, hurling it at the creature and screaming to draw its attention. The beast snapped its jaws just inches from Mary Jane's legs, leapt over her, and charged after her younger sister down the riverbank. Mary Jane forced herself to her feet despite the violent trembling that racked her body. Her hands wouldn't obey. Her legs seemed to forget how to move. Precious seconds slipped away. She glanced around for a weapon, but all she saw were stones and sticks, none of them useful. She had a knife on her belt, but the beast wasn't likely to let her get close enough to use it. Unless... Mary Jane grabbed a long stick, about the width of a shovel handle, tore a strip of fabric from her skirt, and lashed the knife to the end. Then she ran after her sister. By the time she caught up, the beast had already overtaken Annie, pinning her to the ground. Her sister's high-pitched scream pierced Mary Jane's ears. Without thinking, Mary Jane jabbed the makeshift spear into the creature's thick fur. The strike was too weak and clumsy to do any real harm, but it was enough to draw its attention and its fury. The beast let out a shrill growl and turned. Its snout and fangs were slick with blood. Mary Jane gripped the spear tighter. What happened in the next few minutes she would recount over and over when she returned to town. The beast attacked, and she defended herself. Attack after attack, thrust after thrust, until she managed a lucky strike, plunging the spear into its chest. The creature staggered backward before fleeing into the woods. Her story soon became a rehearsed set of phrases that practically told themselves. Attack. Defense. Attack. Defense. Strike. Retreat. Simple. But there was one thing Mary Jane never told anyone. The moment when their eyes locked. The trembling fear she felt then, and the overwhelming fury that consumed her when she realized whose blood stained the beast's face. From that second on, it no longer mattered whether she survived. What mattered was killing the monster at any cost for every drop of blood it had spilled from her dear little sister. That, she thought, was why it ran away. When the creature disappeared, Mary Jane dropped to her knees beside Annie's mangled body. The beast had torn her face and chest, yet somehow left her alive. Annie's breaths came in ragged gasps, and her fingers clutched at Mary Jane's skirt. Unable to call for help or leave to fetch it, afraid the creature might return to finish what it had started, Mary Jane cradled Annie in her arms, softly singing a lullaby through her tears until her sister went silent. She returned home at dusk, dragging Annie's lifeless body on a makeshift stretcher. Her tattered dress was soaked in blood, but Mary Jane bore no serious wounds herself. Only deep scratches on her forearms, as if the beast had mocked her. Mary Jane was the first survivor able to give hunters a detailed account of the beast's appearance, build, and behavior. Her neighbors, awed by her courage, dubbed her the Defender of Lemhi, likening her bravery to that of a heroine from ancient tales. But Mary Jane knew better. She wasn't a hero. She hadn't saved anyone. Tucking her flask into her belt, Mary Jane straightened her skirt, smoothed her hair, and stepped outside. The procession had already turned onto the next street. The moment the townsfolk saw the Defender of Lemhi, a hush fell over the crowd. People instinctively parted, giving Mary Jane a clear path. She stepped closer to the glass case, her presence commanding silence. Slowly she pressed her palm against the cold surface, gazing at the taxidermied beast within. Then she let out a disappointed sigh. It still wasn't him. Kathleen heaved the heavy cover off the well and dropped the bucket inside. It struck the water with a dull thud, followed by a faint splash, signaling it was time to haul it back up. For 3 years now, Kathleen had carried out this mundane task with her eyes closed. She no longer had the strength to look into the depths of the well. The mere thought brought her to the brink of despair. Yet she had never confided in anyone about the connection between her fear of wells and the death of her beloved son Ben, one of the beast's first victims. She poured the water into her own bucket, then trudged home with a heavy gait. Around her, excited neighbors and their children rushed past, all eager to reach the town's administration building where the beast's taxidermied body would be displayed on a pedestal for the next few days. Inevitably, someone would stop to ask if Kathleen planned to join them. She'd snap back that she didn't care about the damned beast, alive or dead, and she wasn't lying. Nothing would bring her son back. Ben had been a smart, kind boy, so radiant and warm that he melted the hearts of everyone who knew him. Kathleen still couldn't fathom how she had managed to raise such an extraordinary child, given that she herself was neither gentle by nature nor, to be honest, fond of people. In her youth, Kathleen had been beautiful and ruthless. She toyed with people's souls the way children toy with crude wooden figurines carved for their amusement. By all rights, she should have reaped the whirlwind, having sown nothing but misery. But then Ben came into her life, gazing up at her with angelic blue eyes, and the malice within her began to dissolve. Kathleen started to believe that some higher power had mercifully granted her a second chance, a chance to bring a truly good person into the world in her place, and to become, even in the smallest way, worthy of being called his mother. But Ben died when he was just 9 years old. The beast had attacked him in a pasture, sinking its sharp teeth into his face and nearly severing his head. When Kathleen saw his mutilated body, something inside her shattered. Her mind clouded, and she was overcome by the image of another child, Ben's age, floating face down at the bottom of an old well. Kathleen had no doubt that this was her long-awaited reckoning. Young Kathleen had been a piece of work, to say the least. Discovering early on the power her beauty held over others, she learned how to manipulate her father first, and then any man foolish enough to drool over her. At 11, she had given herself to her father's friend in exchange for a carved wooden pendant that had once belonged to his wife. From that moment on, anyone who wanted to share Kathleen's bed had to pay for it, whether with pretty trinkets or good food. Her family, after all, was dirt poor, even by the standards of their isolated corner of Idaho. But Kathleen had always known she'd survive, even if her entire family starved. The only man who didn't pay for Kathleen's company was the local blacksmith, Gaspar. But that wasn't out of love, far from it. In truth, Kathleen despised him and feared him down to her very bones. Gaspar was a cruel and vengeful man, though only his wife, 2 sons, and Kathleen knew the truth. To everyone else, he wore the mask of a dependable, kind-hearted neighbor, always ready to lend a hand, a devoted family man admired and respected throughout the county. People trusted Gaspar as much as they valued his craftsmanship. Beneath his charming exterior and easy smile, Gaspar was a true monster. The first time they were together, he made that perfectly clear to a terrified and battered Kathleen, explaining that there was no escaping him now. That night, she learned a lesson she would never forget. A man's words and smiles could not be trusted. Anthony, on the other hand, was Kathleen's age and lived next door. Their fathers had been friends since their youth, working together on the ranch and often sharing a drink. Naturally, they dreamed of marrying their children to one another. Kathleen had always known Anthony had been infatuated with her since they were kids, but she never took his feelings seriously. After Gaspar entered her life, she stopped believing in love altogether. Besides, she and Anthony were too different. He wasn't like anyone she knew. As a child, he would catch mice and frogs to see how they were built, horrifying his parents and Kathleen alike. As he grew older, he struck up a strange friendship with old Tom, the local hermit. Neighbors whispered that Anthony brought animals to Tom and took part in bizarre rituals with him. Rumors circulated that Tom dabbled in dark magic or witchcraft. Kathleen didn't put much stock in the gossip, but she was certain there was something off about Anthony, no matter how hard he tried to win her over with gifts. It was safer to keep her distance from Tom and his apprentice. Kathleen's 16th birthday turned her life into an unending nightmare. The day began with an argument with her mother, who, in a fit of anger, threw Kathleen out of the house despite an approaching storm. With nowhere else to go, Kathleen ran to the barn where she usually met Gaspar. But the barn wasn't empty. Soaked to the bone, Kathleen pushed open the door, only for a flash of lightning to illuminate the horrifying scene before her. Gaspar stood there, and lying at his feet was the naked body of 9-year-old Johnny, the neighbor's son. The boy's neck was bent at an unnatural angle, and he lay motionless on the cold ground. Kathleen didn't want to think about what had happened in the barn that night, how little Johnny had ended up there, or how much fear and pain he must have endured before his life was snuffed out. All she could think about was that she would be next if she couldn't prove to Gaspar that she posed no threat to him. But how? What could she say or do? Gaspar struck her hard for coming uninvited, then shouted at her, his anger punctuated by blows. Kathleen endured the beating silently, without defending herself or begging for mercy. When Gaspar paused to catch his breath, she threw herself at his feet, hastily professing her loyalty and love. Then she proposed a plan she knew would condemn her soul for eternity. Gaspar carried Johnny's body out of the barn into the pouring rain, while Kathleen followed, her dress heavy with water. Together they reached an old well. Gaspar tossed the boy's lifeless body into the dark shaft, and Kathleen pulled her cherished pendant from her neck, throwing it in after him. The necklace would lead the neighbors straight to her. She knew she would be blamed, but had already decided to pin it on Anthony. No one would be surprised if Old Tom's apprentice had sacrificed a human for one of his rituals. All she had to do was make everyone believe her version of events. Kathleen spent the rest of the night in Gaspar's barn. By morning, Johnny's body had been found. Kathleen played her part to perfection. Crying and wailing, she told the neighbors she had wanted to tell the truth immediately, but had been too afraid of Tom and his disciple. Now, backed into a corner, she was ready to testify against Anthony. Just as she'd planned, the townsfolk didn't want a trial. They wanted swift justice. Anthony's death was meant to be agonizing but brief. However, he managed to escape, disappearing into the dense forest. No one dared to go after him. Kathleen hadn't heard from him since, but she was certain someone would come for her one day, if not Anthony, then someone else. That someone arrived in the form of the beast. Kathleen carried the water bucket into her house, spilling some onto her dress and soaking it, as if reenacting that fateful rainy night. Then she fastened a rope to the beam in her ceiling. Everything was about to end exactly as she had planned 15 years ago. While the beast's taxidermied body was paraded across the region, Lieutenant Richard Boyle awaited its arrival in Boise to confirm its identity. The dead creature was to be presented to the state governor, and of course the authorities wanted Boyle's professional opinion. Was this truly the beast or another mistake? No one cared that a year earlier he had already killed a similar predator. If the beast had returned, then he must have failed, and the blame lay squarely on him. His arrogance and overconfidence, people believed, had led to another bloody chapter. Boyle passed the time waiting at a small inn on the outskirts of Boise, keeping company with 2 women who didn't care about his tarnished reputation. Each morning he would descend to the common room, sit at a secluded table with them, order wine and roasted meat, and toast to the death of his glory. No longer a hero or savior, Boyle had become a man disgraced before the entire state. From time to time, strangers would join Boyle at his table, hoping to drink on his tab, and he was always ready to tell the story of his victory. A year ago he had arrived in the region as the state-appointed hunter tasked with eliminating the threat. The summer had been dry, and the townsfolk lived in constant fear. The previous hunter, hired by the authorities, had failed miserably, and Bole was confident he would do better. He had his methods. The first thing he did was interview survivors of the predator's attacks. Their descriptions sounded too fantastical, as if dictated by terror. Bole decided the beast was nothing more than an unusually large, clever wolf. His hunts were massive in scale, with groups of volunteers combing the forests, shooting wolves, and hauling their carcasses to a communal pyre. Yet none of the slain wolves matched the description of the beast. Still, his determination inspired the locals. After months of terror, hope began to stir in their hearts. The beast, sensing it was facing a formidable opponent, seemed to escalate its attacks. Bole examined the victims' bodies and was struck by the sheer power and size of the predator's jaws. He kept his observations to himself, unwilling to let his men lose heart. Yet the beast's audacity infuriated him. More and more he fantasized about killing the vile creature, stuffing its carcass himself, and displaying it in his home, where it belonged. What had started as a routine assignment had become deeply personal. For 3 months, James Chapman tracked the beast through the forests of Idaho, killing over 1,000 wolves. He slept no more than 5 hours a night, devoting the rest of his time to hunting or planning. The only person who truly took the mission as seriously as he did was a young farmer named Travis Stewart. Travis stuck to him like a shadow, the only local who approached the task with genuine commitment. He didn't sit by the fire drinking whiskey like most of the other volunteers. Instead, he confidently followed the dogs, rifle in hand, among the other hunters. James respected the young man for it. So when the creature burst from the bushes and lunged straight at Travis, James felt fear for the first time in years. The monster was enormous, just as the survivors had described, but its appearance cast doubt on its nature. Black fur streaked with sparse reddish patches, an elongated snout, and disproportionately large paws made the wolf look like something otherworldly. Travis managed to fire a shot, striking its shoulder, which only enraged the beast further. The next shot belonged to James, hitting the creature square in the eye. Chapman could have sworn he heard the crunch of bones as the monster fell. Travis, who had collapsed to the ground, clutched his rifle with trembling hands, unable to reload it in time. For a few moments, the clearing was filled with shocked silence. In that silence, the monster slowly rose onto its front legs and let out a low, guttural growl. James was the first to snap out of his stupor. He grabbed a rifle from a nearby hunter and fired a third shot, finally killing the wolf. It took 8 men to carry the carcass back to camp. There, under the cheers of the gathered hunters, the wolf was gutted. In its stomach, they found a child's forearm, confirming James's theory. It was a man-eating wolf. Its size rivaled that of a small cow. Later, in a letter to the governor, Chapman wrote that he had never seen anything so ferocious, massive, or resilient as the wolf from Snake River Canyon, as the creature was quickly named. News of the beast's death spread rapidly throughout the region. That evening, James got blackout drunk for the first time in his life, celebrating his greatest victory at Travis's ranch. The whiskey loosened the tension of the past months and loosened both their tongues. All night, James recounted his adventures, then listened as Travis spoke of his father, whom the townsfolk called the warlock. He listened to the confession of a man forced to live under the same roof as a creature no less monstrous than the wolf from Snake River Canyon. Something in James's hardened heart shifted at those words. James left Idaho 3 days later. By then, the creature had been stuffed as he had intended and was being paraded across the region for all to see. 2 months later, the taxidermied beast was sent to the state capitol, and Chapman was handsomely rewarded and praised by local authorities. In the eyes of the territory, he was a hero. The story could have ended there. But the beast returned a month after the governor had viewed the wolf from Snake River Canyon. That was when James Chapman's days of glory came to an abrupt end. No longer was he a celebrated hero. No longer was there a victory worth remembering. There was no hope, no future. Chapman exhaled deeply, replaying the events of the past year in his mind. He came to a decision. He would no longer wait for fate's forgiveness. The governor would be outraged when he found that his former protégé had disappeared, but the hunter couldn't have cared less. He dismissed the women, settled his bill with the innkeeper, sold his rifle to a pawnbroker, and was never seen again in Idaho. Travis pushed away from the dinner table, his plate untouched. Outside, the taxidermied beast was being displayed on the streets for the first time. Ranch hands bustled about, excited and jubilant. But Travis couldn't bring himself to eat a single bite. Travis tried his best to feel the same relief that seemed to ripple across the region, but all he felt was unease. How useful Chapman's blunt, no-nonsense manner would have been right now. He could imagine the hunter looking him straight in the eye, snorting and telling him to stop sulking. The beast is dead, and that's final. No other townsfolk would have tolerated such treatment, but it would have been just the jolt Travis needed. Maybe then he'd feel a little lighter. But Chapman hadn't replied to a single letter since the day the damned beast reared its head again. At first, Travis had written cautiously, expressing his concern and doing his best to convey friendship. He'd invited the hunter to return and finish the job, offering to cover all expenses. When his first, second, and third letters went unanswered, the tone of his messages began to shift. Carefully at first, and then with mounting frustration, Travis poured all his fear, anger, and disappointment onto the page, directed at both the cursed monster and Chapman himself for his silence. But those words too disappeared somewhere between Idaho and Washington. That's when Travis realized he no longer had a friend and would have to rely on himself. After all, he'd already defeated one beast. Charlie's father, Elijah Asher, was known locally as the warlock and feared like fire. Many of the rumors about him were exaggerated or outright fabrications. For example, it was said he whipped his workers every morning just to hear them scream, or that he dined on the flesh of disobedient children. But one thing the stories got right: Elijah was a cruel man, especially to his own family. Charlie barely remembered his mother. What lingered in his memory were chestnut curls, the scent of lavender, and the sight of her crying at her vanity. He remembered bruises on her shoulders and neck, a strained smile, and her pleas for him to be a good boy and not upset his father. She disappeared without a trace when Charlie was barely 5 years old. One morning, she stepped out onto the veranda for some air and never returned. None of the workers saw anything. That same day, his father launched a search that spanned 2 months, first across the ranch, then the entire county. But it was all in vain. She ran off with a lover, Elijah concluded. Sometimes, though, Charlie suspected it was a convenient lie. Something truly terrible had happened to her. If she'd run away, she would have taken him with her. She would have found some way to send him a message after all these years. These thoughts often kept Charlie awake at night. Sometimes he imagined his mother lying in a filthy ditch, her throat slit, her eyes clouded with death. Other times he saw her on a pristine beach in a light white dress, standing beside a man who truly loved her. In both visions, she was impossibly far away, but his father was now always within arm's reach. Charlie's childhood was steeped in fear. Don't upset your father. That lesson was seared into his mind after his first punishment. It happened the day before his mother's search was called off. Elijah stormed into his room drunk, dismissed the nanny, and then beat Charlie mercilessly, first with his fists, then with whatever he could grab. "You worthless mutt," he roared. Charlie passed out and woke up 3 days later. From that moment on, he did everything he could to avoid provoking Elijah's anger, just as his mother had taught him. But his father's wrath didn't always follow reason. Sometimes it came without cause, or because Charlie broke rules that changed with his father's moods. It seemed to bring Elijah pleasure to watch his son freeze in fear, then scramble to beg for forgiveness without even understanding his offense, or to see Charlie tiptoe around the house trying desperately to anticipate his father's wishes. On rare evenings, Elijah would be in a good mood. He'd sit Charlie down by the fireplace and launch into monologues that terrified the boy as much as his fists. He'd talk about power and dominion over all of God's creatures, be they man or beast. With fervent enthusiasm, he'd speak of how he would one day find a way to control the little people and become the unquestioned master of his land. Charlie didn't fully grasp what his father meant. After all, they already held considerable sway over the county, but it was clear Elijah craved more. Then, for a brief period, Andy entered their lives. Charlie was 8 at the time. Why his father had brought the young man into their home, Charlie didn't know, but Andy's presence was an unexpected salvation. With Andy around, Elijah's grip on Charlie loosened, and eventually, the boy was forgotten altogether. Charlie didn't care what they did in the forest cabin. All that mattered was that his life had become almost bearable. Sometimes Elijah would disappear into the woods with Andy for weeks at a time. During those stretches, Charlie rediscovered sleep and appetite. He could roam the fields with the nanny or play in his room without fearing his father's violent outbursts. For that, he was grateful to Andy. 6 months later, Andy disappeared. Charlie only managed to glean fragments from the whispered conversations of the nanny and ranch workers. They spoke of a boy murdered in the area, with suspicion falling on Andy. But before justice could catch up with him, he vanished into the forest. These rumors stirred Charlie's imagination. The nightmares of his mother, who had also disappeared without a trace, returned with a vengeance. Now, he saw her at the bottom of a well, reaching out with pale hands and calling for him to jump in so they could be together again. Waking from these dreams, Charlie would find his bed wet, and for a fleeting moment, he'd think it was water from the well instead of urine. The boy dreaded his father's return. The last time someone important to Elijah Asher had disappeared, the elder Asher had beaten him nearly to death. What would happen now? To Charlie's relief, his father seemed to forget he existed altogether. Elijah locked himself away in the forest cabin for 10 years, never showing his face. Only his closest workers delivered food and clean clothes to him, helping with his strange experiments but remaining tight-lipped, fueling further fear and gossip. That's how they found him, slumped over his workbench, surrounded by sketches and journals. At 18, Charlie took over as the head of the ranch, assuming full control of its operations and assets. Yet he couldn't bring himself to step foot inside the forest cabin. He ordered the laboratory left untouched, preserved as it was when his father had died, until a time when he was ready to confront the tangled writings of Elijah Asher. For 2 years, the young ranch owner knew peace. Neither the unexpected responsibilities, the mounting debts, nor the vast world beyond the ranch, finally open to him, seemed daunting. After living under the shadow of a true monster, nothing else seemed terrifying enough to matter. Then another beast came. This one was a monster seemingly pulled straight from Elijah's fireside stories of dominion over men. a specter of the past, bringing back familiar nightmares of his mother, this time torn apart by the creature, and his father, who in these dreams had the face of a man but the body of a beast. Charlie knew the only way to win this fight was to capture and destroy the beast. He had to prove to himself that it was just an animal, unconnected to his fears. Charlie Asher held great respect for Lieutenant Frank Bowie. The gruff hunter refused to indulge the widespread fear of the beast, insisting it was merely a man-eating wolf that needed to be hunted and killed. No tales of werewolves or supernatural forces. Bowie's confidence gave Charlie a sense of calm, a reminder that the trouble plaguing the region wasn't so insurmountable as to warrant sleepless nights. But Bowie's silence after the beast's return struck a deep blow. When the creature began attacking again, Charlie wrote to the lieutenant, pleading for help. No reply ever came. It was as if the hunter had surrendered to the monster, leaving Charlie to face the threat alone. This injustice first angered Charlie, then brought him a strange clarity. If Bowie was no longer there, it meant Charlie would have to handle it himself. Charlie had spent 3 months hunting alongside Bowie, soaking up his knowledge about wolves and the organization of large hunts. Now he would have to put that knowledge into practice. Even if the beast returned time and again, he would catch it each time. His own sense of security and the peace of the region depended on it. The townsfolk, driven mad by fear, began to lose hope. The creature continued to target children and women. But there were still those willing to act instead of wringing their hands. Among them was Josh Shepard. Shepard had joined Bowie's hunts in the past and immediately offered his help when Charlie announced a new one. Though Charlie disliked Shepard's tendency to attribute mystical qualities to the beast, the hunter's experience and instincts were too valuable to ignore. Shepard always carried a Bible, reading passages aloud during camp breaks. At first, Charlie found these readings annoying, but he quickly noticed their calming effect on the others. The superstitious hunters became more composed. One day, as Shepard read from the Psalms, something unimaginable happened. From the bushes leaped a massive shadow, growling ominously. The beast stopped right in front of Shepard, as if drawn by the sound of his prayers. For a moment, everything froze. Shepard threw down the Bible and grabbed his rifle. 2 silver bullets cast specifically for the hunt struck the creature. It all happened so fast that none of the other hunters even had time to react. The beast collapsed, lifeless. This new creature bore little resemblance to a wolf. Its yellowish-red fur was streaked with black spots, and its elongated snout gave it an alien appearance. Though smaller than the wolf of salmon, it was no less terrifying. The hunters gutted its carcass and later turned it into a taxidermy display which was shown to the public. The craftsmen worked cautiously, as if afraid the monster might spring back to life. Yet the task was completed. The people of the region began to recover from their terror, convinced that the nightmare had finally ended. But Charlie couldn't share in their relief. His thoughts kept circling back to the nature of the beast. Had he truly faced a fantastical creature summoned as punishment? Or was it the spirit of his father, as he feared most of all? And most pressing, would the creature return? Josh Shepard carefully pushed through the crowd, keeping his eyes fixed on a man with a black eye patch over his left eye. The noisy, excited townsfolk clustered around the glass case holding the stuffed beast. But Josh moved in the opposite direction, determined not to lose his target. The man with the eye patch wove through the crowd effortlessly, as if luck guided his every step. He maneuvered through the throng with ease, disappearing deeper into the streets. Shepard's hunter's instincts told him not to give up. This man had appeared in the region 5 years ago. Known only as Victor, an alias given to him by old gamekeeper Bart Hanley, he had settled in Bart's home and begun helping with his work. Victor shared nothing of his past or his real name. The locals had grown accustomed to his silent presence. But for Josh Shepard, it was different. He had recognized Victor the moment he saw him. A father always recognizes his son, no matter how much he has changed. From that moment, Josh kept Victor in his sights, though every attempt to build a relationship had been futile. When Josh had finally mustered the courage to call Victor his son, the reply pierced his heart. "Your son died years ago. In the well, along with that boy." After that, Shepard stopped pressuring Victor. Yet he couldn't shake the feeling that something deeper lay beneath the rejection. Now, slipping out of the crowd and following Victor, Shepard felt his hunter's instincts give way to a gnawing sense of unease. They had left the town and entered the forest. At first, Josh thought Victor was heading home to the gamekeeper's cabin. But then he veered off toward the old well, a place that had always filled Josh with dread. A chill ran down his spine. Josh had kept in contact with Bart Hanley, frequently inquiring about Victor. The old man always spoke warmly of his helper, praising his diligence and silent, hidden pain. Josh knew the source of that pain. He had caused it himself. Once, he had rejected his own son, refused to believe him, and now Victor had become a stranger. But why had Victor returned to this place? Josh tried to convince himself that Victor sought redemption, even if he didn't realize it. Then the beast appeared. Josh moved through the forest as if tracking prey, careful not to make a sound that might betray his presence. Yet every step weighed heavily. Guilt gnawed at him. Deep down, he feared he was making a mistake by suspecting his son once again. But something told him his instincts were right. The seeds of doubt were planted when Kathleen Warren's son was killed. The gruesome sight had drawn all of Salmon City to the scene. Victor was there too, though he usually avoided crowds. His presence seemed anything but coincidental. Josh had caught him staring intently, almost hungrily, as Kathleen wept, cradling her dead son and staining herself with his blood. That look had haunted Josh for weeks, but eventually he convinced himself it was meaningless. Still, Victor continued to appear in the villages and ranches where attacks occurred. He had a knack for going unnoticed, blending in so well that the terrified survivors and grieving families failed to spot him. And always there was that look, hungry, triumphant. And there it was, that faint smile, barely hidden behind Victor's unkempt short beard. A smile that sent shivers down Josh's spine. He knew his son well. There was no mistaking it. Victor was enjoying all of this. What Josh saw today finally pushed him past doubt and into action. The beast's stuffed body had been placed in the town hall for public display. Josh hadn't seen the townsfolk so uplifted in years. Relief and hope were written across their faces. Hope that the nightmare was over, that their children and wives were safe again. But on one face, Josh saw something different. Was it mockery, contempt, anticipation? It was as if Victor knew something no one else did, and he savored that knowledge. Josh suddenly realized he couldn't ignore his instincts any longer. He had to uncover what his son was hiding. Victor moved swiftly toward Elijah Asher's forest cabin, but just as he reached it, he stopped and began searching the ground beneath his feet. Josh, hidden behind a wide oak tree, watched in disbelief as Victor uncovered a trapdoor, expertly camouflaged with moss and branches. With a creak, the door swung open, and Victor disappeared into the darkness below. The trapdoor closed behind him, blending seamlessly with the forest floor. Josh struggled to locate it again, even though he had just seen it from barely 15 paces away. The concealment was so masterful that no one would ever find it unless they knew exactly where to look. Josh didn't follow immediately. Instead, he positioned himself in a hidden spot nearby and waited. Once again, it all led back to Asher. Even from beyond the grave, the man's corrupting influence lingered. Josh's mind drifted back 15 years, to a time when Victor was still Andy. And for the 1000th time, he cursed himself for not taking his son's fascination with that madman seriously. Andy had been a special boy. Intelligent, thoughtful, curious. It was no surprise Asher had seen a kindred spirit in him. Josh hadn't believed the rumors surrounding the old rancher, so he hadn't thought twice about Andy spending so much time in Asher's cabin. If anything, being close to someone as influential as Elijah seemed like a good thing for the boy's future. But the murder of young Jeremy Carter had shaken Josh to his core. Could it be true? Had old Asher really abandoned his faith and lured Andy to the dark side? Were the rumors true after all? How else could such a crime be explained? Josh felt a burning anger rising in him. If Andy was truly guilty, Josh wouldn't defend him. Everyone must face the consequences of their actions. He hadn't raised a murderer. Still, Josh should have stopped to think with a clearer head. Kathleen's story had been full of inconsistencies. But the fact that Andy hadn't been home that night had been enough to convince the enraged neighbors of his guilt. And Kathleen, that godless she-devil, had expertly stoked their fury, shaking even Josh's faith in his own son. He would never forgive himself for that. Victor emerged from the underground passage after sunset. He carefully ensured the trapdoor was concealed again, then headed toward Bart Hanley's cabin. Josh stayed still in the grass, watching him disappear into the forest. Conflicted, Josh wrestled with the urge to abandon this ridiculous pursuit and leave Victor's shattered soul alone. Whatever secrets his son harbored, Josh no longer had the right to uncover them. But then the image of Kathleen sobbing over Ben's lifeless body resurfaced in his mind. Then Mary Jane at Annie's funeral. And countless others. Broken and inconsolable. Didn't they deserve the truth? Josh forced himself to rise from his hiding spot and approach the trapdoor. He cleared away the branches and moss and pulled the handle upward. The dark void beneath yawned open, and Josh hesitated, unsure of what to do. He had no light source, but surely Victor had found his way in the darkness. Leaving the trapdoor open, Josh stepped cautiously onto the rickety wooden ladder. 12 steps down. Feeling his way along the walls, he found a lantern with a candle inside and a flint. The dim light it cast barely pierced the shadows, but it was enough. Clutching the lantern tightly, Josh ventured into the long tunnel leading toward Asher's cabin. The air was damp and oppressive. Josh worried the candle wouldn't last for the return trip, so he resolved not to go far, just far enough to understand where the passage led. Before long, the walls widened and the ceiling rose. Josh found himself in a larger space. He scanned the walls again, and to his relief discovered a pitch torch. Lighting it, the brighter flame revealed more of the room. Josh had initially assumed Elijah had dug a tunnel to his cabin for some practical purpose. But the deeper he went, the more he realized this was an extensive network of passages and rooms, most of which seemed abandoned. Then Josh caught a scent in the stale air. Animals? The idea seemed absurd, but he followed the smell until he entered the largest room he'd found yet. The moment he stepped inside, he heard shuffling and whining. Large cages lined the walls, and inside something moved as if pleading to be released. Josh looked closer. The first cage held 2 wolves, clearly frightened and baring their teeth. Farther along there were foxes and even domestic dogs, cowering against the bars. But then Josh saw creatures unlike anything he had ever seen before. They resembled the beast in their coloring and the shape of their snouts, though they were much smaller. And they made strange noises, almost as if they were mocking the uninvited guest. Only the occupants of the last 2 cages showed no signs of distress. The torchlight illuminated 2 massive figures with yellowish-red fur streaked with black patches along their flanks. Their glowing yellow eyes locked onto Josh, brimming with fury and a predatory hunger. These were beasts, 2 of them. Josh nearly dropped the torch as the creatures lunged toward him, slamming into the bars of their cages so hard they almost toppled. Panic surged through him, his blood pounding in his ears, his heart hammering in his throat. Overwhelmed by terror, Josh turned and ran, careening through the labyrinth of rooms and passages, desperately searching for an exit. It wasn't long before he realized he was lost. Victor stopped at a small clearing, settled himself on the trunk of a fallen tree, and lit his pipe. He needed to give Josh some time, enough to feel safe and find the path clear. Victor slowly counted to 500, releasing wisps of smoke into the dusky sky, and watching as the orange hues of sunset faded into darkness. Tonight, it would all end, and at the same time, begin anew. He had known for some time that Josh suspected him. Wherever Victor went, Josh's watchful eyes followed. He hovered, offering his help and trying to mend their relationship. But how could something be restored when Josh had abandoned him years ago, at the exact moment when Victor, then still Andy, had needed his father's protection the most? What could a 16-year-old boy do against an entire town of enraged bastards who wanted a scapegoat, not the truth? The only thing he could do was run. Run with all his might, clutching the shattered pieces of his broken heart. And in those broken pieces, he found solace in thoughts of revenge. Andy had always been an outsider. As a child, he was mocked by other boys for his ability to sit still for hours, watching ants scurry about their tasks. Adults shook their heads and whispered among themselves. "A simpleton," they said. "He'll never amount to anything." Andy didn't understand what was expected of him. He simply lived as he knew how. He didn't seek out friends. Instead, he escaped into the woods whenever he could sneak away from his strict mother. To Andy, even the smallest bug was more fascinating than the foolish games of other children, who only knew how to tease and then squeal in terror when he caught a frog or a rat to dissect with his pocket knife. Not for sport, but to learn how God's creatures were made. More compassionate neighbors reassured his mother. He'll grow out of it. He'll come to his senses. But as Andy grew, his curiosity only deepened, pulling him further away from people with their simple concerns and joys, which he couldn't comprehend. The only person he felt drawn to was Kathleen, the neighbor's daughter. But even with her, he couldn't talk about what truly fascinated him. That's when Elijah entered his life. Andy was 14 at the time. He loved hunting trips with Josh and had already mastered the art of skinning game and setting his own traps, which rarely failed. It was these traps that first caught Elijah Asher's attention when he stumbled upon them on his land. Finding the young craftsman behind them was easy. Andy's parents were horrified when they learned their son had been conducting his experiments on Asher's property. They agreed to Elijah's terms without hesitation, desperate to avoid punishment. The terms were simple. The boy would enter Asher's service and use his inventions for the old man's benefit. At first, Andy was furious. His parents hadn't protected him. They'd handed him over to the warlock like a piece of trash to save their own skins. But he quickly realized he'd received the very gift he'd prayed for every night before bed. As it turned out, Elijah wasn't a warlock at all. He was a seeker, just like Andy. A man with an insatiable curiosity and a ruthless heart, without which, Andy had already learned, no real discoveries could be made. If Andy had pitied the frogs, rats, and cats he dissected, he would never have quenched the thirst for knowledge that itched beneath his skin. But without a mentor, Andy had hit a ceiling he couldn't break through. Elijah became the teacher he had longed for. Elijah shared his discoveries with Andy eagerly. He taught him to read and write so he could study journals and records. Then he introduced him to his experiments others might have called monstrous, but which filled Andy with awe. Elijah had been obsessed with creating the perfect guardian. Intelligent, powerful, ruthless to outsiders, and obedient to its master. Why exactly he needed such a creature, Andy never fully understood, but it seemed secondary. The beast had countless potential uses, from guarding livestock against wild predators to protecting landowners from bandits. With such a living weapon, Elijah's holdings would become unassailable. The entire Lemhi Valley would flourish, especially if other regions, or even the governor himself, learned of the beast and sought to obtain one. Elijah often dreamed aloud, painting visions of how life would change for ordinary people with the advent of such creatures. He mused about the entrenched power of those who controlled them. Sometimes his dreams seemed utopian, almost naive to Andy, but he always listened with reverence. The strange fantasies of his mentor kept the young man's interest alive. For Andy, however, the motivation was different. The itch beneath his skin that had plagued him anew the moment he first heard about the Beast Project. Elijah introduced Andy to the intricacies of training and breeding. Dogs, wolves, and occasionally foxes were the primary subjects of their experiments. But these animals proved insufficient. The results fell far short of the ideal. At times, Elijah would sink into melancholy, alternating with bouts of rage. Only Andy could calm him down. Gradually, the village boy gained almost unlimited influence over his mentor, as though their roles had reversed. Andy had become the heart of their research. Had things unfolded differently, they might have truly achieved success. It all started with Kathleen. God, how foolishly Andy had loved her since childhood. He had followed her everywhere, bringing her flowers and trinkets, covering for her with her parents, defending her from neighbors, and believing every one of her lies no matter how many times she wiped her feet on him. Victor now looked back at the lovesick fool he had been, and marveled at his blindness. Kathleen had never loved Andy, not even as a friend. She had used him as she would any other fool who crossed her path. Kathleen had grown up in a troubled family, with a drunkard father and a quarrelsome mother who didn't hesitate to beat her children. Andy pitied her and believed the light in her soul would eventually triumph over the darkness. But it didn't. The darkness in Kathleen's soul was as boundless as her beauty. Andy had to flee, leaving behind his home, Elijah, their shared work, everything. For the next 10 years, he drifted like a leaf in the autumn wind. He wandered as far as Canada, trekked through forests along the border, and eventually returned to Idaho. During this time, Andy learned to survive while avoiding people who might remind him of his past. The key to the beast's creation came to him by chance. During his travels, Andy stumbled upon animals he had never seen before. These creatures were intelligent and ruthless. They hunted in packs, sometimes taking down prey much larger than themselves. Their howls and strange calls lingered in the memory of anyone who heard them. These wolf-like creatures had elongated snouts, and their fur was unnaturally dense. Andy realized these beings were what he and Elijah had been missing. They were smarter and more dangerous than any wolf, and bore no resemblance to any animal native to Idaho. A creature with such qualities was exactly what they had dreamed of creating. After years of wandering, Andy secretly returned to his homeland, bringing with him animals resembling the predators from his memories. He hoped to impress Elijah and inspire him to resume their shared goal. But he learned that Elijah had died just 6 months before his return. This news dealt Andy a crushing blow, solidifying his resolve. If this land had taken everything from him, he would take everything from it in return. Reinventing himself as Victor, he passed unnoticed by most of his former neighbors and relatives. His mother had long since died, and his brothers, preoccupied with their own families, paid no attention to the grim stranger. Only Josh recognized the familiar features, but it didn't matter. Victor found the entrance to Elijah's underground laboratory and resumed the work they had started together. The creatures he had brought back became the foundation for new experiments. 2 years of relentless effort, training, and sleepless nights enabled Victor to create several specimens that came close to the ideal he and Elijah had envisioned. The beast was ready, along with a few others, its shadows. Victor decided it was time to begin his game, and Kathleen was to be the first piece on the board. But the woman who had survived so much cruelty in life had borne a child who, unlike so many others, had lived and grown. That child was the first victim of the beast, the opening act in the tragedy Victor unleashed upon the region. Kathleen's cries and suffering brought Victor fleeting relief, but the pain in his soul remained. Instead, his bitterness deepened. Kathleen was just one part of the problem. Victor turned the beast on the children, symbols of the future of a land he despised. The Lemhi Valley descended into chaos. People were afraid to let their children stray far from home, traveling only in groups. But even that offered little safety. Victor watched the havoc wrought by his creation with satisfaction. The beast always returned to its lair, evading the hunts and traps laid by men like Frank Bowie. Despite the hunter's occasional successes, Victor remained calm. He had lost a few specimens, but he still had enough strength to continue his game. As dusk blanketed the forest, Victor made his way toward the trapdoor. His feet moved instinctively along the familiar paths. He knew these woods as if they were part of him. When he reached the trapdoor, he noticed it was open. This confirmed his suspicions. Someone had invaded his lair. A slow smile spread across his face as he anticipated the encounter. Victor descended into the dark, moving toward the cages where his children greeted him with low growls, their irritation at the intruder palpable. The faint flicker of a lantern betrayed the stranger's presence. Victor followed the dim light down the tunnels. They met in the long corridor leading to the subcellar of Elijah Asher's cabin. Josh stood there holding a torch. His shoulders slumped, and his expression was a mixture of confusion and defeat. He was unprepared for this confrontation. He tried to speak, to explain, to justify himself, but Victor no longer cared. The words he had once longed to hear had dissolved over 15 years of pain and hatred. All that remained between them were the shadows of the past and a chasm that could never be bridged. Victor approached slowly, his eyes cold with fury and disappointment. Josh stumbled over his words, desperate to make sense of his actions, but they fell into the void of Victor's searing gaze. When only a few steps separated them, Victor lashed out, shoving the lantern aside and lunging at his father. His iron grip closed around Josh's throat. A brutal fight ensued. Josh, a seasoned hunter with years of experience, fought back with all his strength. But Victor was younger, angrier, and stronger. He slammed his father onto the stone floor, and for a moment it seemed Josh's life would end there. But then, Josh's hand found the fallen lantern. 2 desperate blows to the temple shattered the silence. Blood gushed down Victor's face and chest, soaking his shirt in hot streams. His grip slackened for a brief moment as he clutched his head. Josh seized the opportunity, groping for a shard of broken glass. Without looking, he struck repeatedly until Victor finally fell still. The silence of the underground lair was unbearable. Josh staggered to his feet, leaning against the walls for support. His body ached, and an icy emptiness pierced his soul. He stared down at his son's lifeless body. It was over. The next morning, Josh returned with a rifle. Methodically, he shot each of the beast's copies in their cages. The other animals he set free, opening their cages and driving them outside. He buried Victor near the trapdoor in an unmarked grave. No cross, no headstone, only earth to hide his son from the world. When Josh returned home, the village was still abuzz with celebration. People spoke excitedly about the stuffed beast displayed in Salmon City's municipal building. The next day, it was to be transported to a neighboring town. Children laughed, and women sang as they worked. Life was returning to normal, as if nothing had happened. Josh sat on his porch, listening to the sounds of a world moving on. He knew he would never tell anyone what had happened in that underground lair. No one would ever know the true nature of the beast. What mattered was that the monster was dead, this time for good. Rising stiffly, Josh entered his house and closed the door behind him. The quiet inside enveloped him like a heavy blanket. A growing emptiness gnawed at his core. What now? For 15 years, his life had revolved around Victor and the beast. Those thoughts haunted him every day. Now that it was over, he faced the daunting task of finding meaning in life again. Maybe work. Maybe raising grandchildren. Teaching them to hunt, as he once taught his sons. Slowly filling his world with light and hope. Josh wanted to believe it was possible. But his conscience gave him no peace. Again and again, Victor's face in his final moments appeared in his mind. The cries and laments of the past haunted him. Josh knew no good deed could ever absolve him. And then there was God, the one who had seen everything, the one who had allowed a father to raise his hand against his son. Josh doubted he could ever forgive either himself or the one who had let it happen. The silence of the house resonated with the silence in his soul, and the question, "How do I go on?" thundered in his mind like a bell.